Hello, Diana. This is Robin. Chris told me that I could write to you, and I thought instead of writing, I'd make a tape, because in that way I can just say whatever comes into my mind, and I'll be more spontaneous and possibly natural, and somehow it seems a little closer. I'll just ramble on, I guess. I just love the opportunity of being able to be in touch with you. Chris may have told you that we were going to Europe this summer, but just a few weeks ago we heard about a cabin in the Sierra, and it looks as though there may be the possibility of buying a cabin not too far from Lake Tahoe in the government-controlled forests, not too far from Desolation Valley. And it's a beautiful cabin with a roaring river in its front door, and a few hundred yards from where the Larch Creek runs into the American River. And it's surrounded by tall, towering redwood trees, and has an enormous stone fireplace, and it sleeps 10 people. And just the thought of it is enough to get us to cancel our idea of going to Europe and use that money, if we can, to buy the cabin if it's possible, and then be able to invite our friends. And just the thought that you and Chris and Eric might join us there and live in the cabin sometime we're there, or even when we're not, because it'll be empty much of the year if we do get it. I talk almost as though we had it already. Is a wonderful thought to me. We miss you very much and wish we could see you. I wish I could see you and talk with you, and it seems so bizarre having 3,000 miles of the continent between us. It doesn't seem very real at all. It seems as though I can just go out of the door and down the street, and there you all will be. It's also strange because I sort of hunger for New England, and California isn't all that wonderful just now, but it is blue-skied and with a soft wind this afternoon. I've just managed to slip a disc or something, and I'm lying flat on my back, unable to move, and this will be the case for the next 3 or 4 days. I've done this before, and I know what it means. And while I'm waiting to be able to walk, I'd like to be able to make this tape, to reach out and say hello and tell you how very much we would love to see you again. Meanwhile, I'm preparing my lectures for my classes on tape, and I just sent Linda off carrying the one I just completed for my literature and psychology course, which was on glass menagerie and Cat on a Hot Tin Roof. And she'd called me about 5 minutes ago saying that my graduate assistant was there. She'd just taken the tape from her, and she was going to play it to the class. And it seems a little silly for me to be lying here now talking to you while I know they are there, sitting there, listening to me talk, another voice of me, talking about Tennessee Williams. I just, before Linda left, I finished the last words on the tape on Cat on a Hot Tin Roof, which I really love as a play. And I still remember the words of Maggie in that. And someone asks her, you may remember, what is the victory of a cat on a hot tin roof? And her answer is just staying on it, I guess, as long as she can. And she offers this against, as I remember, Big Daddy and Brick are talking towards the end of the second act, and I think it's Brick who says, mendacity is the system we live by. Liquor is one way out, and death is another. But against this, Maggie brings her more resilient knowledge and perhaps truer knowledge of the kind of victory that is really possible. I love the play. I'm beginning to like it better than Glass Menagerie, which is so centered on Laura's loneliness and Amanda's abandonment and Tom's dilemma as the artist who is trying to, in some way, embrace them and keep them both within his art at the same time that they are trying desperately to hold him and hold on to their life. Tonight I'll have to make another tape for my film course on the Pumpkin Eater. I brought the film home last weekend, and last night as I lay here in bed, Linda projected it on the other wall of the room, And so I took my notes, and I'll just speak another tape about that. It's a little ironic, the two works in opposition, because Cat on the Hot Tin Roof is about Maggie, who's trying so desperately to get Brick to accept her and make a baby, really. Whereas Pumpkin Eater is about a woman who can't stop making babies. This morning I sent my aunt and uncle, who have dropped by on their way to their home in Oregon, into San Francisco to see the city, and it's rather remarkable having them here, because my aunt was, they're now in their 80s, and when she was a girl back in the 1920s or something, just out of college, she just set out in a car, an old Dodge car, as I remember, with a rumble seat, and drove it around the world all by herself. And here they are in their 80s, and they're still, it doesn't seem that in any way she's changed her style of life. Basically, they're running a rock shop now down in Yuma in the desert during the winter. In the summer, they come north to a farm that they've built by hand right on the desert near the desert in central Oregon. It's rather a pleasure to see my aunt now, because I can remember several times in her life, and I was always very close to her. She was my mother's nearest sister, and was really an aunt in the good sense of being someone I could confide in as I grew up. I can remember several times when she had decided to leave her husband, to abandon her child. She has a daughter, and her daughter's with her now, my first cousin, but she had decided really that she had no use for children or a child, and she was certainly not a mother, and she wondered what she was doing with this child of hers. And times when she went off by herself, and yet here she is at 80 with Vandy, her husband, and the two of them are like a pair of kids scampering around San Francisco. It's rather fine. Linda and Carl are fine. Linda is taking graduate courses in French at San Francisco State and taking courses in Spanish at Marin College. And she loves studying language, especially French. And Carl, we just got word today that the teacher has decided to put him in a group of 5 students who are going to be moved from kindergarten to first grade. And he told the teacher no, he didn't want to do that, I think because he'd miss his television in the morning or something of the sort. But after we talked with him for a bit, he decided that he'd try it at least and see what it's like, and he thinks it might be a good thing. It was my birthday about 2 days ago, and last night while I was lying here in bed, the crowd of people who were in the house downstairs suddenly came upstairs unexpectedly in a long procession with 2 bottles of champagne and a cake blazing with candles, and it was nice. I feel a little bit as though if I'm going to be this old, I guess I've deserved a celebration and an occasion. It's a little bit like the time that the 3 peacocks danced for me. I felt as they did so the day after I'd finished writing that book on Lawrence's The White Peacock, after having spent about 12 years playing with it and tussling with it and working on it. I felt as though I simply accepted their applause. I know that now you're going through a bad time, and Chris has told me something, if little, and I wonder if I could sort of presume to just try to recount in some way the point that I remember best in my life when I guess even though I seem to forget it on the surface, it's always the point that deeply I remember best. When I think I came closest to not being and made a choice for life that I'm glad I made. And this was, I don't know how much of this you know, it's the time when I was in the war, and after I had been wounded in a battle outside of Metz in France. It was an insane kind of battle because a directive had come down from Patton's general headquarters that we were to take a fortress. There was a series of fortresses that ringed Metz at that time, and they were deeply entrenched and sunk into the mountains surrounding Metz. and the directive had come that we were simply to take these fortresses by frontal assault. And this was a little insane because our infantry division had spent some weeks probing those fortresses and knew that they were ringed many, many rings deep with machine guns and with 88s and with batteries of guns, and that were deeply entrenched and well protected. And they couldn't be bombed out, and they couldn't be, and no tanks could approach them. As soon as a tank came into any clearing, there were clear zones of fire that could destroy the tanks. The only way to possibly approach them would be with infantry, but the infantry wouldn't stand any chance at all. And so when the directive came that we were on the following morning to go into a frontal attack at dawn on these forts, almost everyone in my battalion knew that this, because our battalion was chosen to lead the assault, knew that this was suicidal. And it was the first time I ever had any insight into, the experience and the behavior of men who were given this kind of directive, which didn't seem to have any conclusion but one. And most of the men were writing last letters, and they were giving away anything that they valued to others who were with headquarters company or something and staying behind. And there were very few who felt that they would either not be killed or wounded the next morning. The sense of the sureness of this was so great that night, while waiting for the dawn, several of the fellows in the outfit shot themselves rather than face the terror of being shot. And of course, as you move closer and closer towards an experience like that, everything becomes more sharply etched and defined with a hard edge of clarity, so that it can be seen thereafter in the memory more indelibly, and it hopefully is never lost. I regard that experience now, having gone through it, as the most valuable of my life. It was truly a death trip that didn't kill me and came close to doing so, but gave me a knowledge of the perimeters of death that has made my life since then, incredibly important to me because of that. In the darkness before dawn of the next morning, we came down out of our foxholes on the mountains and down into the valley and gathered at the foot of the slope that led upwards to the fortress. It was a long, enormously long, bare slope, several thousand yards of just plain and swelling farmland, where there wasn't even the cover of old crops or a plowed field. It was just a November bleak landscape, perfectly open with nothing to crouch or hide behind. And I still remember the waiting for the moment to begin the assault, when we just lay like so many dark shapes or clots on the field, each of us alone and with our bandoliers and our grenades and our guns, and waiting for a movement forward which seemed inevitably destructive. And I remember the incredible sense that you have as you hear perhaps a church bell ring in a small French village behind the lines somewhere in the middle of the night, and you hear maybe a rooster beginning to crow in a farmyard. The incredible sense you have of the ability to at any moment just stand up and walk away. And as you walked, you would be walking down the valley and across the woods and backwards towards life. And yet nobody did. I won't go through all the details, but there was a word to advance, to begin the assault, and everyone stood up and began walking slowly forward. And we were in the first squad of the first group in the front line, and it was just a long skirmish line that was in depth and spreading out across the base of the field, moving in darkness before dawn. And as we just gradually moved up this hill, it was an enormous hill, we were just all of us waiting for the first flare to burst and the first guns to begin and the first bullets to strike. And it's amazing kind of sensitivity you develop in your body where you feel as though at any second every nerve of your body is capable of anticipating its being the place of the first impact of the first bullet. And so you become extraordinarily sensitive, heightened into an awareness of every part of you being alive and waiting for death. And finally, of course, the flares did burst, and many flares. And before the flares even burst, the German machine guns were going, many of them, and there were men screaming and crying and being hit and crying that they were hit, and crying the usual cries that even bad war literature tells you men cry in battle for their mothers and on the people that they love. Most of us were wearing blankets that we had slit so that our head went through the middle. It was like a poncho, and it trailed out in the wind on either side of us so that it gave a large target, but a target with an indefinable body. And after many of our patrols, we'd come back and we would count the number of holes in the blankets, of bullets that had passed through without touching us. And but when these guns began in this attack, we all hit the ground, and we were pinned down. No one was able to raise his head without being hit. And we just lay there, all the battalions, totally pinned to the ground by this massive fire from the fortress, which now knew that it was being assaulted. And we could have been pinned there, the guns gradually picking off one or another of us as we lay there. I mean, becoming more and more sophisticated, searching us out, and been destroyed in that way. And the Germans would very quickly have called in their artillery on top of us. If someone hadn't done something, and indeed it's amazing how people who are entrusted with such responsibility, sergeants and lieutenants and corporals begin to function as they're supposed to function, calling upon this man or that to make a rush forward and urging another man or to work his way up or to crawl forward, and gradually one man after another rising, running forward, throwing himself at the ground again, either being hit or not as he did so, and gradually moving forward directly towards the guns that were firing at us so we could get within range so we could throw grenades in or be able to silence them with our own firepower. We didn't really have any firepower at all. We were just being fired at, not really having anything to fire back at. And we reached the wire, and I remember that we were all massed behind the German wire, and my sergeant, and I was new in his platoon because I'd just taken the place of a replacement who had been killed the day or so before, told me to go across the wire first. And it was an amazing sort of moment when I had to know whether I would do it and what it meant to do it. And while you are lying there and realizing that by staying there you are just incrementally, individually being selected out and killed, you make such a decision. I remember quickly getting to my feet and running and throwing myself across the wire. I stepped in the center of it, took another step in the center of it, and threw myself just beyond it. And then another soldier came across, and another, and gradually we built up on the other side of the wire and began moving forward. And as we moved forward, there would be, one or another of us would manage to destroy a German machine gun or a nest here and there until finally, it just dawn. Meanwhile, dawn had come. I don't know how much time had taken place, an hour or two. Finally, there was a scene of battle that is one of the incredible and in some ways beautiful memories of my life, and it is of dawn having broken and the sky now light on the field and clear, but yet very early, and dozens of men, dozens of us, standing and simply walking forward through a network cordon of tracer fire, which was just like thousands of golden bees buzzing around us. And every so often a man would be hit and fall, and yet it was as though it were happening in a very great slow motion. I couldn't understand why everyone walked. It wasn't as though anyone any longer cared about hitting the ground or trying to crawl, or it was just this immense, strange, almost indifferent bravery of now 50, 60 men, maybe 100 all the way back through the field, standing and walking through the wounded and the others forward, firing in assault fire, that is from the hip, with your gun forward at whatever was to be fired at. And meanwhile, just not taking what seemed to be ordinary precautions, and yet it seemed right not to. That was the very strange thing. It seemed silly to move forward on an enormous hill like a rabbit hurling yourself again and again at the ground, and yet also it wasn't that you were being foolhardy or you were trying to be courageous or brave. It just seemed that it was correct to move forward with a kind of dignity, with your cape streaming in the wind and the guns firing around you. And I remember passing by my captain, who was kneeling, holding his throat where he had been shot, with a medic trying to assist him, and other men everywhere, wounded, hit, and killed. But those of us who were active, moving in this slow, inevitable movement forward towards the first ridge on the field, and I won't go through all the details of that morning. It must have been close, somehow or other. I don't know where the time went, but it must have been close to noon that we reached the ridge. And I remember a group of us, those who were first there, running the last few yards up to the ridge and kneeling behind it and taking cover behind that little bit of cover, waiting for others to come up. And I can remember at one point, I'm sure I was crying at the time, and tears were streaming down my cheek, but I wasn't aware of it, and as such. And I remember turning to those behind and waving them forward, saying, come on, let's get it over with, let's get it over with. And this only in terms of the logic of really a kind of patent logic. It's the logic that if you are in a situation that is deadly, it's better to lose what lives will be lost in the attempt to master it then, at that moment, than to go through a long process of attrition and spend day after day and month after month of patrolling and losing lives incrementally and gradually and eventually probably more. Just the sense of the relief in wanting to get to master the situation, just have it over with. And so we were there, a few of us at the ridge, and then others came and joined us until we were, the group of us that had gotten through the initial fire in the lower slopes, which was a very small group by comparison with the battalions that had started out at the beginning. Well, I won't try to go through the details of the whole day, but eventually those of us who gathered on this ridge saw the Germans that were between us and the far height, picking up their machine guns and retreating to the next ridge line, and feeling somehow arrogant in the sense that we had won that ground. We decided this was the opportunity, the time to press forward to try to at least take that ground and hold. And I remember that we started, those of us who had reached this ridge, started in a group up a long field that ran beside an edge of a wood. And as we started up this field through the center of it, we felt we were following up on the heels of the Germans ahead. Actually, we were walking directly into a very carefully contrived trap, because the Germans had merely pulled back their machine guns to the next ridge and waited there until we were all out in clear sight on that entire field before they opened fire. And meanwhile, they had established killing zones on the edge of the wood, the only place where there was any real safety, if anyone could get to the wood. And a killing zone is when a machine gun or several machine guns are set up firing at a fixed cyclic rate without choosing targets along a given boundary, so that anything that tries to cross that boundary will be hit. It isn't as though they're trying to fire at anyone. They are simply making it impossible to go through that zone. And of course, frequently what they do is they fire tracers at a certain level with one machine gun, and this lulls a soldier into thinking that's the level at which the bullets are firing, and he may try to go under the tracers thinking that it's safe there, and as he does so, there will be another gun firing without tracer bullets. at that level. Or in any event, it's deadly, and we were caught on the field, and we recognized that there was no possibility of going forward, and there was no possibility of cover, and we were just gradually being picked off by the guns. There was only one choice we had, and that was to try to run for the wood, and some tried and didn't, and I was nearest in some ways. I was, I think, about 40 yards from the woods on a slope, and there was another soldier near me. And we, talking together, we decided that I would go first, and I remember running as fast as I could run towards that wood, and just as I hit the killing zone, which I, at that time, wasn't aware had been established, my legs were cut out from under me, and I remember, since I was running downhill at full speed, I remember shooting straight up into the air as though my legs had been taken out from under me by a baseball bat, just a vast numbing swat. And my rifle shot out of my hands and disappeared in a vast arc. My helmet flew off, and I came down on my face full flat, and just under the guns, I guess, on the very edge of the field, and lay there. And the guns continued to fire at me, but apparently they couldn't depress beneath a certain level, and consequently all they could do was rake my back, and I had a pack on my back, and I remember the guns just tearing that, the bullets just gradually tearing that pack right off my back. And in that moment, I can remember, again, this incredible, unbelievable sensitivity of every pore of my body waiting to be hit in every place, and not knowing how badly I had been hit yet. And I lay there. After a long while, and the guns, I realized that I was under a killing zone in a way, and the guns probably couldn't depress any further, therefore I couldn't be hit any further. I realized my situation, and I gradually, very, very carefully and gradually, almost indiscernibly, began to crawl forward as I was able, to inch forward towards the edge of the woods. And I pulled myself into the edge of the woods, and about 5 yards beyond the edge of the woods there was a shell hole, and I pulled myself on my arms backwards into it. So I lay on my back facing, looking up, but tilted down with my legs above me in the shell hole, which had some water in it, and it was just mud and dirt and twigs and rock. And it was there that I lay for the next 3 days and nights, almost constantly under shell fire, because our own artillery had decided that after the attack had obviously failed, had decided that the Germans were in that wood, and continued sporadically but continuously to pour their fire on top of me, where I was in that little wood. And so I was there for this long period of time. It was freezing weather, and sometimes it was sleet and soft snow that came down, and then it would turn to rain, and then it would melt on me and on the ground, and then the sun might come out briefly, and it was a strange scene. I just went back and listened to part of the tape just before this that I had taped, and I recognized that when I got to the description of how our own guns had fired, I had said, and I just lay there, and I sort of blocked for a minute or two. And that intrigued me, because while I was talking into the microphone, I didn't realize I was doing that. But that's the point at which I had, after the war, that is after I had been in the hospitals in France and in England and then back in the United States, and I was spent several months in the hospitals. That's the point at which, whenever I tried to recount to other GIs who were there with me or anyone what had happened, the point at which I would block, and I couldn't go any further. I would simply say, and the guns began to fire, and then or there I lay, and then I would block, and I couldn't go any further. And it took me some months of trying to write out, trying to think out, trying to live through that experience before I could go any further than that. Actually, what did happen was that I was buried by the impact of the guns, the shells that fell almost on top of me several times. Had to dig my way out from under just mud and dirt and rock several times, and tore the nails off my hands in doing it. And always our guns would fire a pattern of 3 rounds, one long, one short, and then one right on target. And so I could listen to the first round coming in, which would be seen about 50 yards beyond me, and then the next round would be 50 yards short, and then the next one I knew would be either hit me or be within a few yards of me. And it seemed it was that way until finally I was truly shell-shocked, and every time I heard the guns begin to go, I would begin to shake uncontrollably and be unable to control the shaking of my body. Also, shortly late that day, after the battle was all over and there was no more firing from our soldiers, the Germans came back and they repossessed the foxholes they'd abandoned, and they, insofar as they were able, there were some of our soldiers who were still trapped on the field with enough cover so that they could still defend themselves or fire at Germans they saw, and so the Germans were very, very discreet about how they repossessed the field. But you could hear the ambulances moving around on the lower field where we began the attack that morning, and lying there all day long. My wound was, I could see my right leg had been shot through, and I pulled up put a tourniquet on myself and pulled up the elastic on my underwear, kind of winter underwear, over the break and the wound that went right through the leg, so that it both held it there and the blood clotted on it, and it acted almost as a tourniquet and brace and bandage all at once, and stopped the bleeding, and I could feel that I had no sensation in the leg that was broken indeed. But that was a minor wound indeed, and and then as I tried to put more mud up against me to protect my head from observation from anyone, and also protect any part of my body from being seen from outside that shell hole I was in, some Germans on the field obviously saw the dirt being thrown up, and they began to fire on me and cut down the dirt. Every time I'd push some dirt up, their guns would cut it down. So I was observed, and I was known to be there by them. And so it was this sort of situation that prevailed. That night, the German killing squads came out on the field and through the woods, and they were searching for both wounded and American soldiers who might be hiding in the wood or on the field anywhere. And you could hear them. You can hear occasionally screams and gunfire as they found someone. And at one point, a huge German, I had dragged with my hands brush that the shells that had fallen earlier in the afternoon had brought down on top of me, so that there were almost trees and shrubs over me. I had dragged these over me, and at one point, during the night, a huge German with a machine pistol came, and he walked through the wood, and he stepped on the branches on the edge of the hole, and he stepped forward, and he stepped on my hand. And I lay there with him standing on my hand, looking up at him, and he was just a large black silhouette against the night sky. And, of course, I couldn't breathe. He stood there for what seemed an enormous length of time, just listening. And then he moved forward, and he was moving down to the edge of the wood to look down over the lower field and to observe it. And there were many other Germans moving through the wood at the same time, this careful, stealthy search for people like myself, I guess. The next morning there was a truly pitiful and horrible incident, because when we'd gone into attack, one of the battalions that was supposed to support us in the attack, which had been on one of the mountains to our left, hadn't received word, or for whatever reasons had not gone into attack and not supported us. And for whatever bad logic, the next morning, feeling guilty and feeling that they had left us to be surrounded, as some of us were obviously surrounded on that hill and destroyed on that hill, they went into an attempted rescue, frontal assault with a single battalion's strength against all of the re-entrenched German guns. And it was simply a suicidal attack on their part. And from where I lay in the wood, I couldn't see anything, but I could listen to the entire battle, the beginning of their attempt to come up. They were some 1,000 yards behind me, coming up the slope towards me. and the Germans had gone through the wood past me to line up at the edge of the wood, firing at them. I had no gun. I had nothing with me at all, where I was in the bushes in the shell hole, and they just simply casually, almost it seemed, wiped out that battalion that tried to come to the aid of any of us who were up there. The final statistics on these days' battle are extraordinary. I mean, we lost so many men in that one morning battle that we received for it the Presidential Unit Citation, which is sort of the irony of warfare. It's as though for the Charge of Light Brigade you are decorated. What was important, however, was that during this time that I lay there, and it was almost in a total loneliness after the first sort of busyness of that first afternoon and night, I was able to go through incremental stages of reduction and appraisal. I don't know how to name it, except that I could look very carefully and with great stillness and quietness and objectivity on my approaching death. And as I did so, I recognized that I was in below freezing weather with only a light field jacket on. I was lying in a puddle of water that froze at night around me so that I could drink the ditch water that had my blood in it for water or to moisten my lips. I had lost all feeling from my waist down. All my lower extremities were frozen. My hands were so caked and frozen that if I tried to open my palms, they would split and bleed. I was totally covered with mud, my face and everything. I thought this was probably good because it was a kind of camouflage during the day. And I knew I was shell-shocked, and I was pretty sure I had pneumonia. And I had lost some blood, not much, but I had no sensation in most of my body, and I felt that it was just a question of time. And as these 3 days just slowly passed, I recognized that this was indeed the case. I remember having in the first day after I was wounded, having some paper and pen inside my field jacket and trying to write a last note that I could leave in my pocket or something of the sort, and realizing after a while the utter futility and rather absurdity of that. I suppose I did write something. The only food I had with me was a package of Orange Lifesavers, and I still never go by a candy store without seeing a package of Orange Lifesavers and being peculiarly moved. But as I was further reduced and weakened and frozen, and in each succeeding hour, I began to sort of make my terms with what seemed to be an inevitable death, and to try to, at first, come to all sorts of bargains and make all sorts of bargains, come to all sorts of agreements with a divine God, where I would be willing to give up this, that, and everything, if only. And I remember at one point saying to myself that, well, all right, my leg was broken. If I were to lose my leg, and I would be so happy to lose my leg if I could only get out of this and live. And that seemed such a little thing to lose. And then, since I realized I'd lost sensation in all my lower part of my body, I said, well, what if you lost both legs? And that seemed finally a very little thing to lose. And we were saying that life, I could settle for life on those terms. I would learn how to handle that, and that would be grand. That would be truly, truly wonderful. And then I remember saying, well, your hands are also probably frozen, and gangrene will set in, or frostbite, and you'll lose your arms. And what if you lost your arms as well as your legs? And so you were nothing but a sentient torso. And I said, well, I remember eventually saying, well, I'll settle for that, truly, very, very readily, because I can see, and I can hear, and I can feel, and I can think, and I can learn how to outwit this lack. And long before I'd even reached this stage, I'd gone through the recognition that I would never see my mother and my father again, and I said to myself, well, I can accept that loss. And then I recognized I'd never see my brother again either, and I had accepted that loss. And when at that year I'd gone into the war, I'd been very deeply romantically in love with a incredible infatuation with a girl whose picture I carried inside my helmet and spoke to every night at 9 and everything. And I remember saying, well, if I never saw her again, ever, could I accept that loss? And indeed I could. I discovered really accept the loss of every person I ever knew, and recognized that I would be happy to settle for life in terms of just living in the world, breathing, seeing, evaluating, recognizing, smiling at, seeing the absurdity of, simply functioning, even if I never saw anyone I ever knew again, and if I finally had no arms and no legs, I'd settle for life on those terms. And as time became longer and it became bleaker and more, I was truly more nearly towards really being dead, I guess. I said, well, what if you had no eyes and you couldn't see, and you were just a blind torso? And I remember feeling, would life really be worth it in those terms? And I remember thinking that over very, very carefully over a long space of time and saying to myself finally, yes, I'd settle for life in those terms, because I could still hear, and just the joy of trying to attempt to decipher the sounds of things happening around me, the reality of objects that I couldn't touch, that were beyond me, and trying to distinguish their shapes and realities, that would be enough. And so I said, well, finally, you're still trying to outwit, I don't know whether I was trying to outwit God or outwit nature. What if you were not only merely a torso, but also blind and deaf, and propped up like a sack of wheat in the doorway of a mud hut on a Mongolian steppe? Would you settle for life on those terms? And I remember saying to myself finally, yes, I'd settle for life on those terms, because I could still feel the change in the air as the wind moved across my cheek and across my brow and down over my chest, and I would know the difference between the dawn and the evening, and I could sense this, and if I couldn't hear it, and I couldn't see, and I couldn't feel, and I couldn't touch, and I couldn't hold, and no one knew me, and I never saw or recognized another living soul in the world, I would settle for life on those terms, and it would be fantastic. I had yielded up and thrown away all my hostages to fortune, and I had let them go, just sort of let them be consumed by the fire. And I knew that outside of them and everything that I called my own, just to breathe against the air was an experience greater than anything else that I could know or hope for, and it would be the greatest beauty and I conceived of it not so much as sensation, but beauty that I could ever know, that could be known. Actually, I'd come through a series of incremental reductions to a place below which I couldn't go. And when I reached that place, well, then I was ready to be alive. I almost knew, that I wasn't going to die. It was the next morning that I remember looking up and seeing a large hare, enormous rabbit, come up to me and put his feet on my feet. And he stayed there just as though my feet, which I could not feel, I couldn't feel him on them even, as though they were a log that he was perched on. And he left that and he hopped up towards my knee and he wrinkled his nose at me and he put his paws on my knee and he looked at me as though I were just part of the earth and the ground around him, as though he made no distinction between me and the earth. And he hopped off, and a few minutes later, I don't know how much later, I was looking up into the air out of which I believe the soft droplets of kind of November misty rain were falling. And there was an enormous bird, an enormous white bird, the largest white bird I'd ever seen, that came slowly down over me and just hovered and circled in a very tight circle directly over me, as though he were looking at me, and then flew off. And I wasn't then, and I am not now, especially religious or mystical or regard this as a sign of any divine providence, but it was an extraordinary thing, a rather fantastic thing, for which I cannot account, but which I felt was simply another sign that I simply was not going to die. And it wasn't long after that morning, that I again smeared what parts of my face may have still been cleared by the rain with mud, and backs of my hands or whatever, and moved slowly, just poling myself on the backs of my upper arms, the only part of my body really that I could use, over the parapet that I had created, the parados actually that I created. Diana, you just heard the phone ring against the tape I was making, and it's at that point that you called, and we talked with you. And there was something rather remarkable in the fact that I was talking to you, telling you of this, when suddenly there you were, also calling us and speaking to us. Notice that's the same kind of coincidence that I was an extraordinary concatenation, simultaneity of events that I was describing at that very moment in the tape. Maybe it just indicates that it's true that there are more things in heaven and earth than are dreamt of in our philosophies, Horatio. It's mostly that it was so wonderful to hear you, so very, very extraordinarily fine to hear you, and the longer we talked, the more you were there, and the more we were really, I could really feel as though I was feeling you, touching you, feeling you touching, and it was very, very warm to be that close to you. And the point is that I guess maybe I make assumptions about friendship that shouldn't be made because others may not feel as strongly. I always, in a way, feel that when there is a deep friendship, that it's that way. It is that warm, it is that close, whether or not we are in contact. If I were, for instance, not having seen you in 1 year, 2 years, 3 years, if I were to see you, it would be as though I had just seen you or walked out of the room with you an hour ago. The sense of time doesn't really exist against it, and nor does it change, nor does it alter fundamentally the sense of warm presence and being together. And it was so fantastically, truly, wonderfully good to hear you. That's the rich thing that I don't know how to get beyond the sound and the reality of your voice and your thoughts, and the fact that, yes, if we were together, this debate, this discussion that we started would go on, and we'd go on from that to another point and another point, and gradually you'd come to your point of view, and I'd come to mine, and Linda would come to hers, and Chris would come to his, and that would be wonderful, and that would be life, but they would all be involved and part of one another, and that is also wonderful, and that is life. I don't have more to add now. I'll want to get this tape in the mail. I'm not able to get up and about, so I'll have to give it to Linda to mail off tomorrow. And I simply wish you well, to get well, to be with us again and to recognize your value to us and the value of, I guess the thing I was trying to get at when I gave you that long recounting of my experience, the value of fundamentally of every unique individual life. We're not able really, finally, I don't think, to make decisions as to our own value and what we mean and what we are and what our significance is and what we know, because it's always, I've always been proven unsubtle and inferior to the truth, which is always beyond me and above me and better than I can know. And therefore, my own tendency is to always feel that I'm in some ways, unprepared to know what the true nature of the beautiful in myself is, or the true nature of the ugly in myself is. Always another can see it better than I can. This almost suggests and requires a kind of act of faith, where you have to take on faith and trust the sense of the essential goodness of, significance of, meaning of ourselves. And this is something that is best known to history and not known to our own subjective, involved, perhaps fundamentally unperceptive because too involved vision. I guess I'm asking you to trust and to have faith and to believe us when we speak of your value and your beauty and your importance and the fundamental significance of what may at times seem to be insignificant. Give my love to Chris, and take good care of yourself. We'll be in touch soon.